it's dramatically worse than they were 30. They're dramatically worse than they were 30, 40 years ago, and it's still very hard to come up to alternatives. There's still some sense in which Harvard is at the top of the pecking order, but yeah, I think we have to try to find just ways to exit the system altogether.
But isn't it ultimately...
There's no way to sort of co-opt it, to change it from within.
Right.
Those are all, I think, complete fool's errands.
But I guess a situation where Harvard and Yale, or the New York Times, to skip over to another kind of institution, they're institutions that have value because people say they have value, right? It's that simple, right? Having been to Yale, I can say that it has really, really minimal actual value. There's no question in my mind that the value that it has is...
I think when you're saying things like this, that's not what... You're not even supposed to say this.
Why?
Well, because if they have value because people say they have value, then if someone like you says the things you're saying right now, that's undercutting what other people are supposed to say.
Right. Well, that's the whole point of this. That's why we're here. I don't mean to freak you out, but that's exactly what I want to talk about, because you realize this is true, right? There are people who are unwilling to say that, or unwilling to see that they've become politically correct asylums. There's pure madness, and their kids, you're spending all this money so that your kid can catch this virus and have a messed up worldview forever. And once people realize that, people stop giving money, once people stop saying, I want my kid to go to that place, those places won't any longer be able to have the value that they're seen to have. And so
I'm slightly more pessimistic. I mean, I think they are very robust. They're not going to go away that quickly. The analogy I would have for Yale or Harvard is it's like a Studio 54 nightclub. And you have, which is probably bad for the morals of the people, and maybe it's good for their status, and we can sort of debate which is more important, which is less important. But these institutions are remarkably robust. If you were a university president, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, one of these places, and you had some secret fantasy of getting lynched, and you wanted a coalition of alumni, students, faculty to come after you, you'd give a speech saying, we are giving such a great education that we're going to increase the enrollment. We're going to let more people in. We're going to double or triple our enrollment over the next 20 or 30 years. We're not, since we're serving the whole world, in 1970 there were 200 million people in the U.S. Now there are 8 billion in the world. It's 40 times as many people. We're just going to double our enrollment. We'll still be, and you would get lynched because people understand it is a zero-sum tournament. It's not a positive-sum education. It's not about education. It's a Studio 54 nightclub you're running, and for what that is, it can be pretty robust for a long time.
Yeah.
There's probably some point where it gets so deranged that...
I mean, we're effectively there. I honestly have to say that where we are now, there's a brilliant novel out. I've interviewed the author on my radio program, Scott Johnston. It's called Campus Land, and it is brilliant. It's a brilliant criticism, lampooning of the whole world of, Ivy League culture, but generally higher ed. And you see that it eats itself at some point. We're kind of at that point. How long can it sustain itself? I mean, again, I say the same thing about the New York Times. The New York Times has value because people say it has value, but when you really look at these places, at some point the word has to get out to the alumni, to the parents. It's not as good as it used to be. It's not what it once was. Somehow I mean, you have to allow that it's possible to have that kind of we could call it a market correction. It has to be possible.
And I would have predicted it 30, 40 years ago. So it's been harder. I'm not saying, like, next decade I think they may finally break this decade, but there's probably something about the student debt that's unsustainable. We had $300 billion in 2000. It's up to $1.7 trillion today. So I think there are certain trends that I can't see going on for another decade even. And so I think something is going to break.
Isn't it a little bit like the Soviet
top
Union?
colleges, not so clear.
Isn't it a little bit like the Soviet Union? I mean, at some point, it has to break down. At some point, the truth will out. So the fact that it could go on for 7 decades is horrifying, but it did end, And I guess I wonder, because I wouldn't have said that 100 years ago, Yale and all these places were corrupt, lost, leading young people astray. I don't think it was true. I think it's something that's more recently true, or it's a kind of a flower that has finally come to bloom. We know that Yale was going, a lot of these schools were going in those directions already in the 20s and the 30s, but it didn't really come into the mainstream so that you have the madness that you're seeing until now. So I guess it seems to me that it will take a while, but it has to fall apart. In other words, I'm not sure how they can sustain it.
You know, I think the overall system can't be sustained because of the runaway debt. The top parts of it, you know, it's possible it can just keep going because it's exclusive, and this is what drives it. You know, I think you know, I have this sort of theory that one of the reasons, you know, Republican political leaders, senators, congressmen, governors aren't going after the universities more is because they still just want their kids to go to the top schools. So if you were a senator, or
some of those people are in this room, by the way,
or you know, and you know, it's we had this crazy college admissions thing where it was, you know, people can get in through the front door or the back door or the side door, and you know, I think all these places, there's probably some number even at Harvard or Stanford where if you make this number, your kid can get in no matter how unqualified your child is. I think it's something like $25 million. And you know, I think it would be helpful to publicize these things, but the fact that there are people who are doing this suggests it's going to keep going for some time. And it's. But
it is. I mean, I know what you mean, and I fear you may be right, but I'm still thinking that because we're talking about this, people hadn't been talking about this. It seems we've arrived at a point where it's possible some people will see this, and if you see what is happening at these colleges, it's dramatically different. I mean, when I was at Yale in the 80s, it was hard for the alumni to know the lunacy of political correctness that we were living out. It was hard for them to get it. But now, because of the way the world is, because of social media, I don't mean to bring up a sore subject, but we have to talk about social media. But it seems to me that people can see things that they wouldn't have been able to see even 30 or 40 years ago. But that's a larger conversation. I do want to talk to you a little bit about social media. And
Peter mentioned that these places are so exceptional and exclusive because people simply want to get in, and these universities do not want to accept many people. Now, the natural cause of that is that if there are not many people who can get in, these places automatically become prestigious. And since they are old universities, they get even a bigger boost with regards to their prestige. Now, the interviewer asks how long this situation can sustain itself and how long this trend can go on. Now, Peter mentions that one of the problems is something that we've mentioned in the first video, which is the student debt. The student debt is not really sustainable because it's huge, and there's many people who got a lot of debt, and they slowly realized that maybe this wasn't the right way to go. So the problem is that the very prestige of these places will kind of, as Peter says, probably drive this trend forward. So the universities will simply not just disband or collapse. Although he mentions that maybe that would be sort of an idea worth considering.
Is that you should think for yourself. And I think when I look back on my own trajectory, the mistake that it's hard to know whether I would do it differently. I might still go to college and law school, but a mistake I made was never thinking about what the purpose of it was or why I was doing it. It was just this automatic thing that you did because you were told if you did it, you'd have all these options that would get created, and it would all sort of automatically work out on its own. And in retrospect, I would have tried to think harder about why I was doing it and where I saw it going.
Because this would be a familiar story if you had dropped out of Stanford and become a billionaire. But you kind of played it much straighter than Steve Jobs educationally. Was there a moment when you sort of accumulated 2 or however many degrees when you thought, It's all completely pointless. Did you have a moment of doubt about the education that you had excelled at?
Well, I think there was a moment of doubt at the point when I got onto Wall Street, and you realized that it was basically like this never-ending tournament, and the tournament just keeps going on and on, and once you realize that the tournament's not over in high school, and it's not over in college, and it's not over after that, it forced me to ask more questions about, was this the correct tournament? Was there time to do something different? And I do think that's one of the misconceptions. So one of the big questions about education is, what sort of a good is it? Is it an investment decision, a consumption decision? I think most people think of it as an insurance product, where you're buying insurance to protect yourself from falling through the cracks in our society. I think even that's problematic, because we should be asking why there's so many big cracks, rather than how do I protect myself from it. But the reality is that it's mostly just a tournament, and you have to win the tournament. You have to be realistic about winning the tournament, and the kind of speech that people probably do not give at Harvard, and this is where I think even Harvard is probably wrong, would be, or at Brown or at any other university, would be, freshman orientation. Congratulations, you won the last round of the tournament, and now it's going to just get much harder. And you better redouble the effort, because there are a lot of people who are ahead of you, and if you can't see them, they're so far ahead of you that you can't even see them. And if you were to try to give a version of that speech, I don't think you would last very long as president of any university. Even a much lesser version of that would probably get you booted.
I want to hear that speech in full, but let me take another question from the floor.
Good evening. Tony Wagner, the first Innovation Education Fellow at the Technology and Entrepreneurship Center at Harvard. It's a follow-up to the last conversation. I've just finished researching and writing my 5th book called Creating Innovators, the Making of Young People Who Will Change the World. So I'm going to press you for a little more depth on response to that last question. What are the most important things we can do as parents, as teachers, as mentors, and as employers to encourage and incent young innovators?
Well, I would say, let me just, the educational question, I would say, is that people, the best reason to learn is because you're interested in the subject matter, and there's some value in it. And so I would
intrinsic motivation, then, as opposed to
intrinsic motivation. So I think one of the very interesting things with this program we started with the 20 students under 20 was that a number of them had actually already finished college, and they'd actually skipped a number of grades. And so I think the test for parents who have talented students is whether they would encourage their students to skip as many grades as possible. And if you think of education as a tournament, then you're not going to have your kids skip grades, because you want your kids to knock out the other kids on the Harvard application process. If you think of it as learning, you will encourage your student to skip as many grades as possible. So that would be, educational advice would be, to the extent you're able to skip grades, you should skip as many as possible.
Now, Peter mentions that the very notion of going to college is like a tournament. I think he simply avoids using the word rat race. In America, if you want to succeed in life, in your career, you have to go to good college. You have to go to a good high school and be successful there. And many people say that when you go to college, when you go to Harvard or Yale or some good university, it's actually for the presidents of these universities, it's like it's good advertisement to say that you actually have made it, that you already are going to be successful in life just because you went to these universities, which Peter says is not true. Now, but the universities and the presidents of these universities want you to believe it's true. That's why they can uphold their prestige and make more money, get more donations from their graduates and the rich sponsors. Now, there's also a question. Peter gets asked a question about how to encourage young people to be more creative and then invent things and be entrepreneurial. And he actually answers that young people need to feel motivated. and that it's easy to kind of invent new things and be more creative in life, even when you're younger. When you're interested in a field or in a topic, and you do some research, find some value, create something in that field that you are interested in, and that's how you can be creative and be successful. And he also encourages people to finish college quicker if there's such a possibility, and maybe go into business and acquire experience in that area.